In 2005, Marvel Entertainment Group began the planning phase of producing their own films independently. After seeing the success other film studios were having with comic book films based on their characters and them not reaping any of the benefits, they decided to do it themselves. By 2007, they had secured funding of $525 million for their productions and set out to make films based on what characters they still had the rights to. They had to produce 10 movies over an 8-year period. If the films didn't make a profit and they were unable to pay back the loan, the rights of those comic book characters would go back to the bank. It's safe to say the pressure was on. The first film Marvel decided to make was Iron Man, a character who was not well known outside of hardcore comic book fans. Kevin Feige says that they wanted to begin with a lesser known comic book character, but it is also known that most of Marvel's more recognizable characters were owned by other studios. On top of that, they were banking on Robert Downey Jr. as their lead, Tony Stark. Robert Downey Jr. was a great character actor, but also a very troubled one, and at the time was more known for his stints in jail and rehab. The budget was $140 million, and at the time the film was looked at with a lot of speculation. Nobody really thought much of this small movie called Iron Man based on some obscure comic book character. Iron Man went on to gross $585 million. This was a surprise to many, including Marvel. The film was given great reviews, and Robert Downey Jr. was praised for his portrayal of Tony Stark and Iron Man. This was just the beginning. Next was The Incredible Hulk, which made $263 million, another hit for Marvel Studios. Then Thor, and then Captain America, all making decent box office returns. With these characters established, came the Avengers. For the first time, all these characters shared the screen. But they did not stop there. With more sequels being made and more characters being introduced, Marvel proved they could make films within a shared universe, and that these films would make money, a lot of money. The MCU franchise has grossed over $15 billion worldwide, more money than any other franchise in cinematic history, more money than Bond, more money than Star Trek, Harry Potter, more money than Star Wars. It was like the MCU was the blueprint to making money. Studios loved it, the public loved it. The MCU was now an unstoppable juggernaut that was taking the cinema-going experience to a whole new level. But then,
the Marvel type pictures, where the theaters become amusement parks, that's a different experience, and it's not cinema, it's something else.
What did you say?
You know, whether you go for that or not, but it is something else, and we shouldn't be invaded by it.
What?
Something I don't like them. First of all, I haven't seen many.
What? What the
The thing about it is that they seem to be creating, it's another form, and their theaters are almost like amusement parks in a sense. So these films now, I think, are more like theme rides.
How dare you!
Scorsese had hit on a very hot topic with his comments. What made this different was that this wasn't coming from a film critic who was criticizing comic book movies for being comic book movies. It was coming from another filmmaker, a great filmmaker. The man that gave us Taxi Driver, Raging Bull, Goodfellas, some of the greatest films ever made. He created the foundation of film restoration where old films could be restored for future generations to see. These words could not be taken lightly. With the backlash that he received, he had to double down on his points.
Cinema, I got to take a look at that.
He took out an article in Variety where he had to explain a bit more as to what he meant.
See, but I come from a time where movies were films, and that's what I'm saying about the theme park films. For what they are, they can be appreciated. But that's
Many
not
people took offense to the comic book movies being compared to a fairground ride. What is interesting about that point is that the early days of cinema, that is how films were seen. Cinema began life with the invention of the kinetoscope and the kinetoscope parlours that were placed on the boardwalks of New York. This was not cinema as we know it today. It was a coin-operated machine that patrons would view one at a time. There was no story, it was just a selection of moving images on a film strip. But this was enough of a wonder at the time to make people want to part with their money. With the creation of the large projector, crowds could now see these moving images. It was not long before the projection of these moving images was made part of the vaudeville shows that were prevalent of the time. And it was not long before the projected sections of these vaudeville shows became the main attraction over the live acts that had made vaudeville so popular. Scorsese's issue with the comic book film was that to him, it took away from the human element of cinema. He was a student of Federico Fellini, a filmmaker that experimented with the medium of film itself. He created scenes in his films using montage, mise-en-scene. He created moments that would be dreamlike, almost fantasy, but always set within a real context of the story and of the people. His characters were always relatable. The art and the experimentation of film was not visible to Martin Scorsese with the MCU films. What was visible is the well-used special effects and action sequences, and he felt that this was taking something away from the human nature of what cinema was. Martin Scorsese was part of the new wave of cinema of the 1970s. The films that were being made then were way more experimental. He felt that that's what was missing with movies today. People were going to see the spectacle. You wanted to see the action, you wanted to see whatever new effect could be made and put onto the screen, especially with the increase of CGI. He truly felt that the human element was missing from the Marvel movies. Now, this could be true, but comic book films are still very young. And many of the humanistic themes that have been dealt with in comics are only now being shown in films. 2019's Joker is a good example. Joker is directly inspired by two films made by Martin Scorsese himself. Without Taxi Driver and The King of Comedy, we would not have the Joker. Todd Phillips' Joker, set in 1981, it follows Arthur Fleck, a failed clown and aspiring stand-up comedian whose descent into insanity and nihilism inspires a violent counterculture. It's very similar in theme and tone to Martin Scorsese's Taxi Driver, where in that film it follows Robert De Niro playing Travis Bickle, an ex-Marine and Vietnam veteran who works as a taxi driver by night in New York City. One day he decides to save an underage prostitute from her pimp, and in an effort to clean the streets of the city that he sees as being very corrupt. King of Comedy. Rupert Pumpkin desperately wants to become a comedian and approaches talk show host Jerry Langford for a chance to perform on his show. When all fails, he teams up with Marsha to kidnap Jerry. All of these are humanistic elements. All of these are the type of thing Martin Scorsese says is missing from comic book movies. But as we see, they took a comic book character and used two of his films to create something that is still a comic book movie, but is more relatable within the realistic setting. The themes here were depression in Joker, post-traumatic stress syndrome in Taxi Driver, and the desperation of wanting to be accepted in The King of Comedy. These are all themes that you don't really find in many comic book films. This is what can be done with within the comic book genre. Comic book movies have come a long way from the days of Superman and the Batman serials of the 1940s. It was not until 1978, with the release of Superman the movie, that cinema had had a credible depiction of a comic book superhero. And while we had had success stories in between, it was not until the MCU did we have a franchise, and a successful one at that. But here lies another problem that Scorsese points to. The franchises is killing the medium for the smaller filmmaker. Studios are only interested in making films that can guarantee a profit. And what has been the most profitable franchise so far? The MCU. What has generated the biggest box office returns? The MCU. Even the least successful MCU film made the type of money that most films could only dream of making. So now it is getting harder for small films to get greenlit by major studios. On top of that, theatre chains want to fill their seats, and what is it that's filling the seats within the cinema? Comic book movie films. So where does that leave the smaller filmmaker? If their films are not going to fill the seats, where do they go to show them? Filmmakers have had to go to streaming services to get the films they want to get made. The drawback is that their films might not be seen on the big screen. Martin Scorsese himself could not get funding for his film The Irishman, and acclaimed director such as Martin Scorsese could not find funding for a film that starred Robert De Niro, Al Pacino, Harvey Keitel, and the return of Joe Pesci. The only way for him to secure funding for The Irishman was to get the backing off of Netflix, which in turn wanted to release the film on its streaming service and not within the theatre.
Certainly the main thing for me was creative freedom. The trade-off is that it's a streamer. Okay. Yeah. However, I said, but it will be shown in theaters, right? By that point,
to Scorsese, this really is the start of the decaying of cinema as he knew it. More and more people are watching films on their phones, on tablets, or streaming from the comfort of their own home. But people are still going to the cinema to see the big budget comic book films. As with YouTube, films are now being seen as a form of content. Studios will mass produce superhero movies as a way to make money, and the public will consume it as any other form of content that's out there. This is what's at the heart of Scorsese's comments, and he says so himself.
My concern is two concerns, and that is that one is that the filmmakers need the theaters. The nature of the amount of money that's being made with superhero films, naturally, you can't tell a studio or a corporation or theater owners, build a theater for people to come and see this, so they make money in the theater. You can't tell them to stop making their money, but on the other hand, they have to give something back to the culture. They have to create a space for the filmmakers to have their films on screen. Whether they're on screen and then get streamed or whatever, because there's so many venues going to open as to how films are going to be exhibited. This is what has to happen. There has to be a consciousness changing, I think, in this industry, because we're wiped out.